Hello, my name is Maria Hansen, and I'm Executive Director of ELIA, the globally connected European network of higher arts education institutions. As part of the Shift interview series on inclusion, I'm happy to talk today with my colleague David Baile, CEO of the International Society for the Performing Arts, Ispa. Ispa is a global network of more than 500 leaders in the performing arts with representation from more than 185 cities and all regions of the globe. Ispa members include facilities, performing arts organizations, artist managers, festivals, funders, consultants, and other professionals working in the performing arts. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is part of the core values of Ispa, and I'm happy to talk with David Baile today about what that means for his organization and for him as a leader. So hello, David. Nice to see you, and thank you very much for joining us for the interview on the Shift project on the topic of inclusion. Perhaps we can start first with a little introduction by yourself. Tell us who you are and how the topic of diversity and inclusion came to be part of your work.
Sure, and thank you, Maria, for inviting me to be here. Just before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In many ways, Ispa's journey on diversifying and inclusion happened organically because as an arts organization, as an international arts organization, it was really incumbent on us to have as many regions of the world represented as possible. And that's been a real focus of mine, really for the past almost 15 years that I've been in the organization. And Maria, I have to, and you know this from my email, I have to pause and say we've got a very long way to go, particularly when it comes to regards of equity in the organization and for the members and non-members. But we've very much gone through stages and identified opportunities for us to bring more people into the organization and create a more inclusion. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, so I know when looking at the Ispa website, there's actually a really clear statement of values around equity, diversity, and inclusion on there. It's part of the Ispa core value statement. And I just wanted to read that to kick us off a little bit. It reads, proactively ensuring the right of all members to participate without discrimination, including with respect to, and here follows a list, political and/or religious beliefs, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic circumstances, national origin, race, age, or disability. So I think a key word in the statement to me is the word participate. And what does that mean for Ispa, and how do you apply this value statement to the aspect of participation?
It's a great question, and it's really something we've continued to struggle with. When I think of participation, I think of accessibility, and kind of three challenges I would say that we've had and still struggle with are one, financial accessibility. Different regions having the resources to join Ispa, to attend a Congress, to travel. Second being linguistic. Although we're an international organization, we're very much operating in the English language. Admittedly, over the past 18 months, as a result of the pandemic and the technology, we've been able to create a lot more access around language, through the various platforms. And disability is also another boundary to participation for many people in terms of coming to the organization, in terms of having full access everywhere. But I'm just wondering, Maria, if I should back up for a second and just kind of talk about our journey to how we got where we are.
Please.
So I would say prior to 2000, Ispa was a relatively insular organization. And when I say that, I mean it was largely Eurocentric, large institutions participating in the organization. And around that time, we started looking at, we hold a mid-year conference every year in a different city around the world. We started looking at moving away from kind of the traditional cultural capitals and moving to, I don't want to even say emerging cultural capitals, just cultural capitals that we weren't as aware of as a membership. We weren't necessarily working. I think the very first step we took there was having a conference in Durban, South Africa. But since then, we've been to Seoul, Bogota, Sao Paulo, Leeuwarden. So a huge variety of sometimes smaller centers, sometimes significant centers in terms of size, but we just haven't had that engagement. And what that's really done is introduced a much broader regional participation. And so that was really probably our first step in terms of starting to diversify and be more inclusive. Probably with that, we also discovered in terms of going to these regions, that I was talking about earlier, the financial accessibility, that it was one thing when we were there for people to be able to participate. Quite often we'd get local funding to support registration and people to attend the conferences. But their ability to participate following the conference was very limited, particularly in terms of coming to our annual conference in New York. So it was at this juncture that we introduced what we call a fellowship program. And that was to facilitate emerging and mid-career leaders to participate in ISPA. And we had a real focus on people coming from developing regions. So since 2007, we've provided more than 500 grants worth, I think about $1.8 million to facilitate participation. And more than once. Many of the programs work for as up to 3 years. And we are seeing, again, more sustained engagement. At the same time, we also realized that those voices weren't represented in our governance model. It was, again, a largely Western governance model. It's founded and based in the US. So, we use that not-for-profit charitable model. But we do have a board of directors of 25 people and 7 standing committees. And well, Maria, you were chair of the nominating committee at one point. And what we really worked together on and with the rest of the board was ensuring that those voices from outside, again, of Eurocentric regions were represented in the governance model. And the last thing I would just mention, and let you get a word in edgewise, is with our annual conferences or with our conferences, one of the things we've really been focusing on the past number of years is having diverse voices on stage. And we found also that's had a huge impact in terms of creating more interest in the organization in terms of hearing a range of voices, but also engaging with the speakers or the moderators for greater participation in the organization. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a long way to go, and I can talk in a bit about sort of where our journey is continuing.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the different layers of it. And I recognize it very much also from now running ELIA and having similar aspects to consider. I'm just wondering, this is sort of an in-between, but did the pandemic change the issue around the financial accessibility? Because financial accessibility, of course, also means having a budget to travel. And we found that we were able to reach a completely different group of people because money was not a burden or a barrier anymore. How was that for Ispa, and how are you taking that forward?
Another great question. So New York was locked down on March 16th, 2020. March 22nd, we launched our first online program. We'd never done it before. We just kind of dove in using Zoom, not surprisingly. We had talked for a number of years about having a digital membership to really address this issue of people not being able to afford to travel, still being able to participate. The reality was that we didn't feel we had sufficient programming to actually make a digital membership valid. Well, all of a sudden, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was we had the programming. So we launched, I won't go into the details of them, but we launched regular convenings through Zoom and a number of other programs to create access. And then we also, this year in 2021, we did our annual Congress as a totally digital event. And with that, we introduced a digital membership. So the digital memberships are less than half the cost of a regular membership and affords people to participate in the organization remotely. So we probably about 15% of our members are now digital members. Of that 15%, half of them really came in as new members. And in many cases from regions we didn't really have that well represented. So I think we're just scratching the surface of it, but it also means, we do very much want to continue down this road. So next year, we're looking at a hybrid Congress. And what exactly that's going to look like, we're still working on, but it does mean we'll have an in-person component and a virtual component for remote participation.
Yeah, which is super interesting for all of the people listening to this, many of whom run networks and work for networks, because that's a conversation we're all having. And of course, also really interesting in terms of the carbon footprint. And so there's another interview coming up with that for sure. Just wondering about the input and the sort of the impulse that has come from the membership for this work around diversity and inclusion. David, you mentioned the fellows and bringing them into the governance, and I remember certainly other aspects of diversity being discussed with members. Have you found that it's a top-down initiative, that the top felt we should be doing this, or has it also been driven from bottom up?
It's really interesting, Maria. I think we entered into the fellowship program with a lot of hubris. We have so much to show these people. We have so much to teach these people. And what we quickly learned was we had so much to learn. The established leaders, yeah. And it's made a huge difference in the organization. It's made a difference, as I mentioned earlier, about who the voices we're seeing on stage or hearing on stage within the governance model, and just within what the conversation is, because it also, in addition to providing a regional or cultural diversity, it also brought in a real diversity in terms of age, for example, and also in terms of what area people were working in the arts. I mentioned earlier that, prior to 2000, we had mostly institutional members. We've really exploded now with creative producers, independent producers that maybe work with institutions for some of their gigs, but they're not connected on an ongoing basis to one institution or another. And that's been a really interesting development in terms of how people are working internationally and kind of the shifting role. We're also seeing a real shifting with artist managers becoming much more producers as opposed to simply representing an artist, and being much more engaged in terms of their work. So it's really, the sector is changing very quickly. And I think we're about to see some really significant changes moving forward, because one of the other things the pandemic really brought to the forefront were issues of equity, of power, and, to your point, sustainability or the impact of climate change. I think we as a sector really recognize and value the international work, particularly, as society becomes more xenophobic, I can't think of a more important time to use culture as a tool for understanding and strengthening us as a global society. So with this reckoning is also the reality that, during the pandemic, it was artists who really took the brunt of it. They were generally the people that weren't employed. They were the people who lost contracts. And more, I think institutionally, we're looking at, or we as a sector, I should say, are looking at how do we share the risk, as opposed to doing a pay as you play kind of model for artists, investing in the work that they need to do leading up to the performance. Removing just things like restrictions around performance rights and, making touring in a region much more feasible.
Yeah.
Again, we're not getting into it as much today, but to your point about sustainability as well, that can be a real opportunity.
Incredibly important. Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to focus in more on this aspect of equity, and I think there's a lot more thinking that has to happen. I think that's a really, really good point to make. I was wondering, because one of the things that has struck me at Ispa is that around the accessibility in terms of disability, Ispa has actually gone quite far. And do you have a story to inspire us with, and how that sort of is entering into now the standard that you set out?
So probably about, I would say for an extended period of time, we really didn't have anyone in the membership or in the governance model, or really speaking on stage, that had a disability or identified with a disability at least. And a few years back, we invited a speaker who runs a theater for deaf artists in England. And she delivered, well, I was going to say a keynote, but it was much more a provocation. And she got on stage and said, I've been enjoying Ispa for the past 3 days and met some incredible people. And I've been hearing so much about this diversity. But if there's so much diversity, why am I the only blank deaf person here? And it just, she said it with such power. I think everyone just kind of, they sprang to their feet really and applauded the reality, not applauding the reality that there weren't more deaf people here, but the acknowledgement that there weren't. And so that's really taken us on a journey. Everything we do now is subtitled as appropriate. Much of it, we're also providing transcripts. With the subtitles, we also now have the technology to translate into different languages, which is a different issue. But also we, there's in the United States and in many countries, there's kind of minimum standards in terms of accessibility or accessibility for disabled in Americans. Here it is, ADA. As opposed to trying to meet the minimum guidelines, we strive to undertake best practices. So providing safe spaces for people with disabilities, ensuring that we reach out to them so that they don't have to reach out to us. Being very proactive in terms of identifying how we can facilitate participation. And, one of our staff members is their kind of one of their primary roles. But again, like everything, we've got a huge distance to go. I don't think we've been effective reaching out to the disabled community to ask them to participate, to encourage them to participate. So one of the ways, as I mentioned, we're starting to do that is having voices on stage again.
Yeah, very good. And David, I have, before we get to the wrap up, I want to ask you one thing that interests me, and that because we've known each other for a long time, how do you feel that this work has affected you as a leader? If would you say that you're a different leader now than you were 5 or 10 years ago? Can you say something about that?
Sure. I'm just it's profoundly is my initial response. I don't think I take things for granted as much. I'm less likely to make assumptions about people, and it's really the best way I think I can describe it is it's really because my position just innately in the organization has so much power. I think it's critical for me to let go of that power, to facilitate voices, to support people. I think I've always been a fairly generous employer, but it's grown leaps and bounds in terms of acknowledging my power as a leader in an organization, as a white male, as a Canadian, so many layers of privilege. And I think that recognition has been a huge growth for me.
Oh, thank you for that. That was really beautiful.
Oh,
I will wrap it up by asking you 2 more questions. And one is, where can people find out more about Ispa? And is there anything that you would pass on to anyone listening as a tip to read or to watch, something that has really affected you with regard to this topic?
Sure. Thank you. www.ispa.org is our website, and information is there. As I mentioned, we are planning on doing a conference in New York, January 11th to 13th. And again, we'll be launching that in September. I'm very excited. We just launched a podcast, and it's publicly available on Google Podcast, Apple, a number of other platforms. So our first podcast is a series called Meditations On. And in fact, one of the meditations is on disability in the arts. So I encourage you to check it out. There will be a link on our website within about a week. In terms of resources, there's no shortage of information out there. Maria, you may remember at the conference in Leeuwarden, one of the delegates asked one of the speakers, "What do we need to do? What should we be doing?" And the speaker responded by saying, And it kind of stopped everyone in their tracks. But there's a book called Caste, which I think is critical reading, just in terms of recognizing privilege. And I really encourage people to seek out books such as Caste. There's certainly no shortage of podcasts out there that talk to inclusion and equity. And I think just looking at yourself and your organization and what are you not doing?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for all of this, David. And I will leave you to the morning in New York and say bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Maria. It was a real pleasure to be here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.